The morning I found the fish, I had been posted on the mountain for 6 weeks, three of them laid out on the porch step like someone had set them there with care. Bull trout, each one between 18 and 22 inches, still cold from the creek, the pale orange of the flesh showing faintly through the translucent skin where the early light caught it. I stood on that step in the gray of a July morning and looked at those fish, and then looked at the Moultrie camera I'd strapped to the corner post of the porch the second week of my posting. And I had a thought that was very clear and very simple. You already know. I checked the SD card before I made coffee. I reviewed the footage 3 times before I did anything else. Then I drove down Forest Road 90 to Randall and bought a second card at the hardware store. Because whatever was on the first one, I was not going to risk losing to a corrupted file or a full drive. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from and if you've had an encounter like this. My name is Tom Hadley. I grew up in Packwood, Washington, which is a timber town of about 400 people in Lewis County, about 12 miles west of White Pass and close enough to the eastern boundary of the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest that on a clear day you can see the ridge line above the forest from the school parking lot. My father delivered fuel oil out of Morton for 23 years. My mother kept accounts for a logging contractor in Randall. Neither of them had gone to college, and neither one thought less of me for not going either direction. And when I enrolled at Lower Columbia College in Longview in the fall of '87, they were quietly proud in the way that people of their generation in timber country were proud, which was to say they didn't say a lot about it, but they made sure certain people at church heard about it. I grew up in the timber the way kids do when the place is the whole world, not hiking it on weekends, living alongside it in the margins of it, using it the way you use the ground under your feet. I knew the trails on the east side of Packwood before I knew their official names. I knew the trees by smell before I knew them from a field guide. The western red cedar by a specific clean sweetness that has no real equivalent anywhere else in the Pacific Northwest. Warm and slightly sharp and unmistakable once you know it. The Douglas fir by the resinous pitch that comes off the bark when the afternoon sun hits the south-facing trunks and the sap heats and the air around the tree takes on a quality that is both sharp and heavy at once. The hemlock by its silhouette against the sky. The leader drooping with a flexibility that the fir doesn't have. The top branch bending under its own weight. I knew the sound of a Roosevelt elk moving through salal brush before anyone told me what the animal was called, and I knew the track of a black bear in creek mud before any teacher showed me the distinction between the 5-toe impressions and the claws. I knew these things the way you know the house you grew up in, from the inside, without having to look for them. I got my associates in natural resource management from Lower Columbia in '89 and spent the next 2 years doing seasonal trail work. One summer with Cowlitz County Public Works, one with the Gifford-Pinchot in a trail maintenance crew based out of Randall. The permanent position opened in the spring of '91, my second application for it, and I got it on the second try, and I have held some version of it since. I was 24 years old when I started full-time. I turned 57 in the spring of this year. The arithmetic on that is not complicated. The early years of a ranger posting have a quality that is different from the later years in ways I have thought about often and haven't fully resolved. When you're new, the territory is still strange. Not threatening, just unread, the way a book is unread before you open it. The trails are officially documented but not personally known. The animals are species you've studied rather than individuals you've observed across seasons. The weather patterns, the drainage behavior, the specific way a particular ridge sheds water after heavy rain versus moderate rain versus wet snow. All of that takes time to accumulate. And while you're accumulating it, you are still working at the surface of the place rather than from inside it. By the time I had 5 years at Randall, the ground had started to feel like mine. By 10 years, I understood it in a way that I'm still not sure I can put into language. By 16, which is where I was in the summer of 2009, the forest and I had an arrangement. I knew what it was going to do, and it knew, in whatever sense a place can know anything, that I was not going to misuse what it showed me. The Randall District, formerly the Cowlitz Valley Ranger District of the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, though everyone in the district called it the Randall District after the town where the office sat, covers the northern third of the forest from the Lewis River south to the Cispus River north. The Gifford-Pinchot itself is 1.3 million acres of southwestern Washington, and the ground my district covered included the Dark Divide roadless area, the Upper Quartz Creek watershed, the eastern flanks of the Tatoosh Range, and the approaches to the Goat Rocks Wilderness. It is not the most remote national forest in the Pacific Northwest. It is not the most famous one, but it is old and large, and it holds more ground than most people who live in Washington state have ever set foot on, and the section of it I'm talking about, the Dark Divide and the drainage south of it, is different from the rest of the forest in ways that took me years to understand, and that I'm still not sure I can fully account for. The Dark Divide. If you've spent any time in serious Pacific Northwest wilderness or in the documented history of Bigfoot reports in this country, you know the name. Roughly 50,000 acres of unroaded forest bounded by Forest Road 90 to the south, the Cispus River to the north, and the Divide Trail corridor to the east. No maintained through trails in most of it. No cell service, no power lines. The forest road system that surrounds it stops at its perimeter, and the timber inside is dense and old, and largely undocumented at the resolution that would actually matter. I've been on foot in the Dark Divide more times than I have account for. I know it well enough to feel comfortable extending a solo patrol into it when conditions are right and my schedule permits, and comfortable in that context means something specific that most people who have not worked the backcountry in that part of Washington would not fully recognize. It does not mean familiar. The Dark Divide is too large and too old, and too much of what happens there happens without human witnesses. What it means is I know what I'm walking into, and I know what I can handle, and I know how to read what the forest shows me. Those three things together are what I mean by comfortable. And a quick thing before we get into what actually happened up there. A lot of what I've learned about Bigfoot doesn't fit into these videos.
Quick thing before we get into it. I have a book coming out. It's called the Bigfoot Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. It's kind of my baby. So if you want to check it out, links down below. And let's get you back to the video.
The area has a reputation that precedes most conversations about it. The volume of reported Bigfoot encounters in and around the Dark Divide runs higher than virtually any comparable stretch of the Pacific Northwest, which is already the most densely reported region for such encounters in the country. I knew the reputation before I ever set foot in the drainage. My awareness of it in my early career was roughly equivalent to my awareness of any unverifiable claim. I filed it in the category of things I had no evidence to address and moved on. Field rangers are empiricists by training and by necessity. You work with what the ground shows you. The ground shows you tracks, scat, browse lines, weather damage, and the slow accumulation of everything that makes a forest function as a system. Everything else you leave alone until the ground shows you something specific. The ground showed me something specific in the summer of 2003, and I didn't look at it for 6 years. I'm going to tell you what happened when I finally looked. The Quartz Creek Patrol Cabin sits on a bench above the creek, about 4.5 miles from where Forest Road 90 crosses the Lewis River. The access is a spur off the main road, 2 ruts with a grass median, western red cedar, and western hemlock closing in on both shoulders, close enough to scratch the truck's paint if you drift. The bench is a flat stretch of maybe 60 yards between the slope above and the creek below, and the cabin sits at the center of it with a clearing extending south to a tree line of old-growth Douglas fir, starting at 60 yards from the porch steps and continuing without a break for miles. The cabin was built in 1958, cedar shake siding gone silver gray from decades of wet winters, a covered porch along the south face, 2 interior rooms. The main room has a Monarch wood stove against the north wall, a propane range along the east wall, a two-way radio on a shelf above the door, and a table with 2 chairs by the single window facing south over the porch and the clearing. The back room has the bunk, the desk under the north window, and the storage shelves holding maintenance supplies and the composition notebooks that serve as the cabin's institutional memory. Going back to the first summer the cabin was occupied, no electricity, propane for the range and the lanterns, a hand pump well on the north side, an outhouse 40 feet into the timber to the west. I had been posted at Quartz Creek twice before 2009, 2003, a 2-week stretch in July that I've already mentioned and will return to. 2007, another 2 weeks in August, which was as unremarkable a stretch of fieldwork as I've ever logged, and which I think of differently now than I thought of it at the time. The full summer assignment, June through early October, a 4-month solo posting, had been debated at the district level for 2 seasons. The argument in its favor was that recreational traffic in the Quartz Creek drainage was increasing steadily, and that a seasonal presence was necessary to maintain the boundary with the Dark Divide roadless area and document the off-route travel showing up on aerial survey photos. The argument against was the standard one for solo remote postings: liability, emergency response time, the difficulty of maintaining reliable contact with a ranger whose nearest backup was 45 minutes by truck on a good forest road day and potentially unreachable in the weather events that hit that drainage from October onward. In the spring of 2009, the argument in favor won. I took the posting without a significant negotiation because no one else in the district wanted it, which was partly because the cabin's reputation as a hardship assignment was well established, and partly because most of my colleagues at that point were either younger and building families or older and past the point of interest in 4 months in a 2-room cabin with propane lighting and a 2-rut access road. I wanted it because the tracks I had found in the Quartz Creek bank mud on July 14th of 2003 had never fully left my mind, and because 6 years of not thinking about them had not done anything to resolve them. I arrived at the cabin on the 1st of June 2009. The drive up Forest Road 90 takes you east along the Lewis River, the river brown with snow melt in early June and running loud against its gravel bars. After the main road, you take the spur north, and after a mile and a half, the cabin appears through the trees. The cedar shakes gray in the morning light, the porch facing you across the clearing. The creek, Quartz Creek, was running high and fast that early in the season, audible from the cabin porch as a constant low roar that you stopped noticing by the end of the first week, the way you stop noticing any sound that doesn't change. I spent the first 3 days doing early season work, cleaning the wood stove's firebox, checking and replacing the radio battery backup, walking the property and the trail boundaries, clearing 2 blowdowns from the spur road with the chainsaw, hemlocks big enough to be a real job, and by the time the road was open I had sweated through 2 shirts, and my forearms were numb from the vibration. I sat on the truck's tailgate afterward and looked up at the Douglas fir crowns 200 feet overhead moving in a wind I couldn't feel at ground level and thought, here we go. The camera went up on June 10th. I had been carrying a personal trail camera on postings since 2005, always my own equipment rather than USFS-issued gear, a habit I developed after a black bear sow, and her 2 cubs had spent a week using the Quartz Creek Porch as a rest stop during the 2007 posting, and I'd missed most of it because I was out on patrol during their visits. The Moultrie was a good camera for the work, a model I'd been using for 2 seasons by then, with a half-second trigger time and solid infrared performance in total darkness. I strapped it to the northeast corner post of the porch, pointing southeast to cover the steps in the near portion of the clearing out to about 35 yards, adjusted the sensitivity to avoid triggering on wind-moved ferns, ran a test clip of myself walking the frame, confirmed the image quality, and left it running. The first 6 weeks were as ordinary as that posting gets. I ran my patrol routes by day, which covered the Quartz Creek drainage, the boundary with the Dark Divide to the north and east, the trailhead at the spur end, and 2 additional access points along the main forest road. I logged visitor contacts, documented trail conditions, and identified and removed a section of illegal motorized trail punched through the undergrowth near the roadless boundary. ATV width based on the rut spacing, giving unauthorized access to the Upper Creek fishing. I filed a contact report and submitted photographs. Standard work. The wildlife in the clearing was what that drainage produces. Deer every dusk, does and fawns in June, a young buck by mid-July with his antlers just beginning, the velvet still on them, and the rack still growing. A pair of gray jays that made the porch part of their daily circuit, methodically investigating every surface. A pine marten that appeared on June 17th and returned 11 more times in the next 3 weeks, focusing most of its attention on the propane regulator at the north end of the porch with a persistence that was almost professional. On June 29th, the bear, a young male, lean, probably in his 3rd year, stood at the bottom of the steps for 40 seconds, decided nothing he wanted was accessible, and went back into the salal. I checked the camera card every 3 or 4 days, swapping in a fresh one and reviewing the old one on my laptop in the evenings. The footage was exactly what I expected. Deer, the jays, the marten, the bear, a nighthawk passing through the infrared frame at 2 in the morning and gone in a second. I noted all of it in the patrol log. In the personal notebook I kept alongside the patrol log, a composition book I'd carried on every posting since my first year at Randall, I noted it with more detail, with the texture that the official record couldn't hold. The quality of the light at the end of a long trail day, the sound of the creek at different water levels, the specific way the Roosevelt elk moved through the east drainage in the early evening, the bull always upwind and the cows spread to the sides, the whole herd appearing and disappearing through the timber the way elk do when they know the ground and you don't. The smell came on the morning of July 8th. I was on the porch before 6, coffee in hand, looking at the tree line across the clearing. Overcast and cool, the way the Cascades can be in early July, even after a string of warm days. The ferns in the clearing were still wet from overnight dew, and the sound of Quartz Creek carried up from below the bench in its constant low register. I was standing at the porch railing, not thinking about much, when the smell came from the south, from the direction of the main tree line, and hit me completely before I had a name for it. Musky, heavy, warm in a way that the cool morning air made distinct, the way any heat source stands out against cold. Not unpleasant, not foul, not chemical, not sharp, dense, layered, something sweet underneath it, organic, alive, the smell of a healthy animal at close range rather than at a distance. I had smelled every animal in that forest across 16 years of fieldwork. Black bear has its own musk, earthy and thick, sweetest when they've been in berries, sharper when stressed. Roosevelt elk carry a heavier grassier smell that is strongest in the rut. Cougar scat is ammonia sharp and impossible to confuse with anything else. Coyote, beaver, marten, otter. I knew all of it. Not as a catalog entry, but as a physical memory in my nose, the kind of knowledge that lives in the body rather than the mind. This was none of it. This was different in the specific way that being wrong about something you thought you knew is different from simply not knowing. The smell was there for about 15 seconds. A slight shift in the breeze and it was gone, absorbed back into the normal early July smell of the Cascades, cedar, fir resin, damp fern, the mineral coolness of the creek below. I stood at the railing for a minute more. Then I wrote in the personal notebook, July 8, 0610, south tree line, musk odor, duration approximately 15 seconds, light breeze, source undetermined. No visual. proceeded with patrol. It came back on the 10th, on the morning of the 12th, from the east side of the clearing, from a different direction. On the 13th, briefly, while I was splitting wood behind the cabin, I stopped swinging and held the maul at my side and stood still in the silence that had replaced the normal forest sounds, the birds and insects gone quiet, and the smell was there for 20 seconds, and then the birds came back and the insects came back, and the smell was gone. By the 13th, I had 5 entries in the personal notebook and had stopped trying to attribute the smell to a bear I hadn't been able to locate. The tracks came on the morning of July 11th between 2 of the smell events. I was working the upper section of the creek bank about 300 yards upstream from the cabin, checking a riffle that the previous season's field notes had flagged as potentially in need of debris clearance. The bank at that point was soft, red-brown mud undercut slightly by the current, the kind that holds a print clearly, the way soft clay holds an impression. I was about to step into the shallows when I saw the first one. My training established the negative before you accept the positive. Confirm it is not a bear before you allow yourself to think about what else it might be. I went through the confirmation methodically. A black bear's front track is nearly round, wide at the central pad, with 5 toe impressions and claw points forward of the toes at a consistent angle that is diagnostic once you've seen it enough times. The rear track is longer and narrower, the heel more distinct, but still rounded and still claw-pointed. This print had neither of those features. It was long. Long with a narrow heel, a distinct arch, a broad ball, and 5 toe impressions arranged in an arc at the front. The proportions were recognizably bipedal. The size was not human. I carry a 25-foot fiberglass tape measure on patrol. I measured the longest clear impression, 17.5 inches. I measured the width at the ball, 6.5 inches. The depth in that mud, 1 3/4 inches. I wear a size 12 boot. I weigh 205 pounds at the start of a field day before any hard climbing. My boot leaves an impression in that same mud at about 5/8 of an inch. I took photographs with my phone. No cell service, but the camera function worked. I recorded the GPS coordinates. I found 2 clear tracks and 1 partial. The stride between the 2 full impressions measured 4 feet 9 inches. The step was clean and even. The stride consistent on both sides, the weight distribution from heel to ball to toe reading as the gait of something upright and walking, not something that had dropped briefly to bipedal movement and returned to 4 legs. I stood on that creek bank for a while after I finished measuring, the tape coiled in my hand, the creek moving past below me, and I thought about the entry in my own personal notebook from July 14th of 2003. I thought about the 6 years since. Then I walked back to the cabin and I wrote 4 pages in the personal notebook and nothing in the patrol log. I checked the camera card on the morning of July 15th. 6 in the morning, flat gray light outside, the coffee pot on the propane range, the reader clipped to the laptop. I swapped out the card and sat at the table and went through the review software. The first 12 clips were the usual commerce of the clearing after dark. The doe and her fawn at dusk on the 14th, using the open grass on a transit route they'd been running all month. The pine marten for the 12th time, inspecting the propane regulator with focused determination. A nighthawk through the frame at nearly 2 in the morning, lit briefly in the infrared and gone in less than a second. A moth making extended circuits near the camera's IR illuminator. Normal. All of it normally, in the way that normal things look on a card full of them. Then the clip at 2:17 in the morning. I've reviewed that clip more times than I can accurately report. I know it the way I know certain sections of trail I've walked until the feet know the ground without the eyes. I know every second of it. The camera was mounted at chest height on the corner post pointing southeast, and the frame covered the steps and the near clearing to approximately 35 yards. In infrared, the clearing was the familiar palette of gray-green tones, ferns, pale, shadows under the trees deep, the geometric line of the porch steps running diagonally across the bottom third of the frame. I had reviewed more than 2,000 clips from this camera over 4 years, and I knew the infrared rendering of a Pacific Northwest clearing in summer, the scale of things in it, where deer hid in the frame and where the bear had hit, and what a marten running the railing looked like at chest height IR. The shape that entered the frame from the lower right at 217 was not at a scale I was prepared for. It came from the direction of the south tree line. Not running. Moving at a walk. A walk that covered the distance from the tree line to the steps in far fewer paces than the same walk should have taken. The stride long enough that the speed was deceptive. The movement appearing almost unhurried until I counted the steps, and the steps didn't add up to the distance. It was at the foot of the steps before I had fully registered it as being in the frame at all. The camera was set at chest height, which meant the midpoint of the frame was approximately 5 feet off the porch deck. What entered the frame at 217 cleared that midpoint on the lower half of the figure, which told me before I processed anything else that the top of what I was looking at was well above 5 feet. The upper portion of the figure was outside the frame. The lower edge of the frame cut the figure off at approximately mid-thigh. What was visible in the frame, a torso and upper legs that communicated mass in a way that changed the scale of every reference point around them. The porch post, the step risers, the railing. The chest was broad, the arms were long, the forearms proportionally heavier than the upper arms, the hands large enough that they changed the scale of the step they came down to. Those hands reached the top step with a deliberateness I watched 3 separate times before I was certain I was reading it correctly. Not dropping, not tossing, setting. Each fish placed in a careful parallel arrangement, the same care a person uses when they are laying out something they do not want damaged. 3 fish, dark shapes against the pale wood of the step in the infrared. The figure straightened, stood. For approximately 8 seconds, the figure stood at the top of the steps, and then something happened in that 8th second that I had to freeze, frame, and zoom to confirm. The head, which was above the frame, lowered slightly, the way a person lowers their head when they want to see something below their line of sight. And in that lowering, the face came partially into the upper edge of the frame, 1 second, maybe less, a partial frame, the broad flat of the cheekbone, the heavy shelf of the brow above it, and below the brow in the upper edge of that brief partial, the eyes. Deer eyes in infrared are flat discs of reflected light, white, bright, and hollow. The tapetum throwing the illuminator's flash back hard and simple. The eyes in that frame were different, warmer. The same warm amber I would later see in open daylight reflected differently in the infrared, held the light differently. The depth behind them, not the mechanical flatness of tapetum, but something that received the light and did something with it before returning it. There was aperture behind them. I had to zoom and sit with the zoomed image for a long time before I could accept it as what it was and not look for another explanation. The clip ran another 7 seconds. The figure stepped back off the porch in a single backward step, 2 feet clearing the bottom step cleanly, then turned and moved toward the south tree line, and the tree line absorbed it in a way that I rewound and watched 4 times before I could satisfy myself that I was not misreading the recording. One moment the frame had the figure in it. 2 steps later, the frame had trees. No transition, no fade, no gradual disappearance. The forest simply took it. I drank my coffee. It had gone cold during the review. Then I drove to Randall. Not to report. I knew before I reached the truck that I was not walking into the district office and dropping an SD card on anyone's desk. What I needed was the drive. 45 minutes of Douglas fir and hemlock and the Lewis River through the trees on my left, and a destination at the end where I could buy something ordinary and do something practical and feel the distance between what I'd seen on that screen and the world where the morning was a normal morning. The hardware in Randall had SD cards. I bought two. I bought Rainier and a bag of trail mix and a box of the rectangular crackers that go with the shelf-stable cheese I kept in the pantry. And I drove back up the mountain in the early afternoon with the footage on the card in my shirt pocket and two decisions made before I turned back onto the spur road. The first, I was not going to file a report. The second, I was not going to delete the footage. Those two decisions look simple from the outside. From the inside, on that specific afternoon, they were the hardest professional choices I had made in 16 years at the Randall District. Not because I wasn't clear about what I was choosing, I was clear. Because I was choosing to manage something that my professional training said belonged to the institution, and I was choosing to manage it privately instead. And I knew the difference. Filing a report, even an informal mention to the district supervisor, would set a process in motion that I had no mechanism to redirect once it started. A confirmed sighting on camera, with physical evidence in the form of tracks with the location coordinates in my GPS, would generate institutional attention at a level I could not control or contain. Biologists first, then a team, then equipment, hair snares, scent lures, additional camera traps, and eventually, if the evidence accumulated fast enough, aerial thermal surveys and something that would look like capture preparation to anyone watching from the outside. I had watched the USFS response to a confirmed cougar denning near a busy trailhead in 2006. The process had been professional, thoughtful, and completely indifferent to the animal's preferences about being observed and documented. The cat had relocated. Whatever had left those fish on the step of this cabin had been here, in this drainage at this cabin, in contact with the rangers who used this cabin, since at least the summer of 1961. I didn't know that yet when I drove down to Randall on July 15th. I would know it 6 weeks later when I finally read the logbooks carefully, and by then I would understand that the choice I made that afternoon was the same choice that every ranger who'd spent a season at Quartz Creek had made in their own way and for their own reasons. The drainage had a way of producing that choice. I was just the most recent person to make it. I cooked one of the bull trout that evening. The other two I left on the step. In the morning, the other two were gone. In their place, 5 more fish. I started leaving things. The first was a Cliff Bar chocolate chip set on the top step at about 8 in the evening on July 16th. In the morning, it was gone. In its place, 4 fish. The camera card showed the figure at 2:14, approaching the step, slowing when it encountered the bar, lifting it and turning it in those hands for about 25 seconds before setting it to the side and placing the fish down, then picking the bar back up before it left. It did not eat the bar at the cabin. It took it. There is a specific quality to a transaction that distinguishes it from an accidental exchange, and what I was watching had that quality. The pause, the examination, the deliberate setting aside, and the retrieval on the way out. That is not foraging behavior. That is consideration. I left a can of Bush's baked beans the following night, opened the beans warm when I set the can on the step at 7 in the evening. I ate half the can for dinner and left the rest because food with a strong cooked smell said something that a packaged bar couldn't. This was prepared. Someone with fire and a cooking vessel had made this from something else and offered the result. The warm, sweet smell of the molasses rose off the can in the cool evening air, and I went inside and did not watch the porch. In the morning, the can was on its side. The beans had been eaten from it without damaging the tin. No claw marks, no crushing of the sides, the can structurally intact. A pile of golden chanterelle mushrooms sat where the can had been. 7 of them, each one stem down, caps arrayed outward, the largest the size of my closed fist. Fresh, cool from the night air. Arranged. I made an omelet. I ate it on the porch and looked at the tree line and sat with the word for what was happening. Not gift, not payment, exchange, which implies a framework of equivalence, an understanding that what moves in one direction has something moving back, an understanding that requires both parties to hold a concept of the other's needs and preferences. An exchange requires two parties capable of understanding it as such. The chanterelles were the first indication that the exchange had a logic beyond food for food. The fish made sense in a transactional way I could hold at arm's length. The chanterelles, arranged the way they were arranged, started to pull that arm's length in. The pattern continued through late July and into August, and it developed in ways I had not anticipated. The fish came on clear nights. The nights when the temperature dropped into the low 40s and the creek ran audible from the porch. The mushrooms came after rain. In mid-July, I found a bundle of sword fern fiddleheads on the step, wrapped in a single large big leaf maple leaf, and the stem of the leaf twisted to close the bundle. The fiddleheads were young and tight-furled, found in a north-facing drainage where they had come up late. I had to look at that wrapping for a long time before I decided whether to count it as deliberate. It was deliberate. I know what deliberate looks like in the field, and I know what random looks like. A maple leaf rolled around fiddleheads and closed with the stem is not random. In early August, the huckleberries on the south slope came ripe. I'd been picking them myself when I had time, taking a plastic bucket up after morning patrol and coming back with a quart or two in an hour of steady picking. What appeared on the step one morning was a wide piece of Pacific silver fir bark stripped from a tree and curved by its own natural bend into a shallow dish, and in the depression of the bark, huckleberries. More than I could pick in an hour at my best pace. All of them ripe. All of them the deep blue-black of fully mature fruit. Not a single pink unripe one among them. Not a single stem still attached. Whatever spent time in that forest knew it at a resolution that my 16 years of fieldwork didn't approach. I had moved the camp chair from the porch to the edge of the clearing in late July, shifting it a few yards closer to the timber every few days. Not toward anything specific. Just reducing the distance, the way you reduce the distance to anything wary by making the reduction gradual enough that it stops registering as movement. By early August, the chair was about 30 yards from the south tree line. I started sitting there in the evenings after I finished the day's work, after dinner, while the light was still going, but the day was settling. I talked not to anything specific, not directly. I talked to the forest generally, the way you talk out loud to yourself when you are working through something and the walls of the cabin are too close. I talked about the day's patrol, about the weather, about the blowdown I'd cleared that morning, about the elk herd I'd seen on the east ridge in the afternoon heat. Normal things. True things. Things I would have said to another person if another person were there. The musk came in from the south on those evenings, or from the east, or once from the north, from a different direction each time, always with the forest going quiet before it arrived. The birds first, then the insects, then the creek sound still present below, but everything else holding, the way air holds before weather changes, and the musk in the quiet, warm, and layered and close. I talked through it. I kept going. If the talking bothered it, it would leave. The talking didn't bother it. I went deep into the dark divide on patrol on July 22nd. Working a section along the northern boundary of my route where off-route travel had been reported the previous season. The access took me through the dense spruce and silver fir north of the roadless boundary marker, through undergrowth thick with salal and the occasional blowdown from the past winter, following a game trail that narrowed and finally faded out about a mile and a half from the road end. I was in a section of timber I didn't reach often. Old growth in places, the understory open under the big trees, the light filtered through a canopy at 150 feet and falling in columns on the forest floor below. I found the first structure there. A Douglas fir about 8 inches in diameter, bent at approximately 7 feet off the ground in a smooth arc and woven into the upper branches of the adjacent fir. Not broken. Bent. The bark on the outer curve of the bend was still attached. The wood stressed but intact, the arc smooth and controlled in a way that weather damage doesn't produce. I stopped and looked at it. I touched the bend. The wood was cold and dry and had been in that position long enough that the bark had begun to form callus tissue at the stress point, the way wood calluses at a long-held stress. I found 4 more within the next 100 yards, arranged in a rough pattern that enclosed a clearing of about 20 feet across. Inside the clearing, the ground was different. No salal, no sword fern. The surface was deep with dry needles and decomposed leaf matter laid in over time, packed down at the center. In the center, a shallow depression about 4 feet long and 2 feet wide, lined with moss and strips of dry inner bark, settled, compacted from extended use. Not recent. Old. Made over time by something that came back to it season after season. I stood at the edge of that interior and looked at it for a long time. I noted the GPS coordinates. I photographed it with my phone. I did not write it in the patrol log. On August 2nd, I found a piece of worked stone on the step. Basalt, roughly oval, 5 inches along its long axis, with one edge showing deliberate pressure flaking, small regular scallops removed along the edge to create a working surface. Not a rock from the creek bed. A tool, or a piece of one, worked by hand with another stone and then used, the patina on the worked edge old rather than fresh, the surface smooth where it had been held. I have worked alongside USFS archaeological compliance staff on heritage surveys in the Gifford Pinchot, and I know the look of intentional lithic reduction when I see it. I put the stone on the desk in the back room. I held it each evening before I went to sleep. The edge, when I drew my thumb carefully along it, was still keen enough to raise a welt. The logbooks were on the shelf above the desk. 8 composition notebooks. I had paged through the most recent ones on previous postings looking for operational notes. On the evening of August 7th, I pulled the oldest one from the shelf and started reading. The first book ran from the summer of 58 through 61. The handwriting in the early pages was careful, the entries brief and formal. The name inside the cover was Walt Hagen. By August of 58, his voice was loosening into something more personal. A grouse nest he'd found, the character of the creek at different stages, the way a section of the east slope was recovering from the previous winter's ice storm. A person learning to see this specific piece of ground. In the summer of 61, the handwriting changed. The name on the second book's cover was R. Hagen, Walt's son or a nephew, or a coincidence of names in a small district. R. Hagen wrote shorter, more direct entries than Walt. On July 21st of 61, large tracks on the north side of the cabin this morning. Measured the longest at 16 inches, 6 inches at the widest. Not bear, no claw marks, wrong proportions entirely. Not elk. These were flat, 5 distinct toes, clear heel and arch. Whatever made them walked upright and was very heavy. Stride between the 2 clearest was approximately 5 feet. I followed them north into the timber for about 100 yards and then lost them on dry ground. No other evidence, no visual. This is not in the official patrol report. I set the notebook down, I picked it up and read it a second time. R. Hagen had stood on the north side of this cabin 63 years before I sat reading his entry, found tracks I would have recognized immediately, and made the same choice I had made on July 11th. This does not go in the official patrol report. The entry after it was the following morning. Trail conditions, visitor contact at the road end, weather. The logbook returned to its ordinary voice and stayed there for the rest of 61. The third book, covering 62 through 66, showed nothing unusual in what I could read. In the fourth book, Summer of 67, a different hand, Theodore Bauer. The inside cover read, T. Bauer, Randall District. In his handwriting, dated August 9th, woke at approximately 0300 to a smell I have not encountered before and cannot describe adequately. Strong, musky, heavy with something sweet underneath it. Not bear. I know bear. Not any animal I have worked with in this district. Present for approximately 10 minutes before it was gone. Went outside. The porch was undisturbed, no tracks I could find in the dark. In the morning, the woodpile on the east side had been rearranged overnight. Not knocked over, not scattered, moved and restacked. I keep the face grain up when I stack for drying. The restacked portion was face grain down. Whoever moved it knew what a woodpile was and knew what it was for, but stacked it differently than I do. I closed the book, opened it again. The woodpile. Moved and restacked close enough to correct that the intention was clear. Different enough to show that the convention was foreign. The same quality as the bark dish of huckleberries, close but not identical, arriving from a different direction and reaching the same destination. In June of 74, a ranger whose name I couldn't read clearly from the faded inside cover, 3 fish on the step this morning. Trout, fresh. The nearest water to the cabin is a quarter-mile down to Quartz Creek, and I have fished the good riffle another half-mile beyond the cabin track. I cannot account for how fish arrived at the step. I left them out the better part of a day to see if whatever left them came back for them. They were gone by evening. A smell I have noticed before this summer, musky and heavy, was around the step in the morning. I know of no animal in this drainage that carries fish from a creek to a porch. He was correct. I know of no such animal either. In the 93 book, the handwriting of a different ranger. D. Sato, the cover read. 5 words dated August 3rd. Prince, North, not reporting. I sat with those 5 words for as long as it took to drink a full cup of cold coffee. And then I found the 2003 entry. I knew it was mine before I finished opening to the page. The dark green cover, the handwriting, the voice. July 14th of 2003. This cabin, this desk, and found tracks in the creek bank above the upper riffle, approximately 300 yards upstream of the cabin. Bipedal. Size approximately 15 to 16 inches, 5 to 6 inches wide. Clear toe impressions, no claw marks. Stride approximately 4.5 feet. Photographed. No other evidence, no visual. Will continue to monitor. The follow-up entry, 3 days later. The smell again this morning. Has been present several times since my second day here. I have been telling myself it is a bear I haven't located. I don't think it is a bear. And then the patrol records resumed and did not stop until the end of the 2003 posting. I had buried it, found it, recorded it, and buried it in the routine of the patrol log, driven down to Randall at the end of the 2 weeks, and spent 6 years since then working to convince myself that the tracks were misidentified, that the smell was a bear I had never located, that the strangeness of 2 weeks at a remote cabin in the deep timber was something that the passage of time would adequately explain. I sat at the desk in the cabin that had held all of it, R. Hagen's 61 entry, Bauer's 67 entry, the 74 fish, D. Sato's 5 words, my own 2003 notes, and I felt something that I am still looking for the right word for. Not revelation in any dramatic sense. More like the feeling of understanding something you have always been about to understand. The last piece, settling into place not with a shock, but with a weight. I had been about to know this for 6 years. Now I knew it. The visual sighting on August 17th was something I had been, without consciously framing it that way, preparing for since July 15th. I was in the camp chair at the edge of the clearing. The sun was behind the western ridge, the sky still pale in that long Pacific Northwest summer way where the light holds an hour after the sun is gone. The ferns had gone a deep saturated green in the low angle of the remaining light. The musk had been in from the south since about 6:30, faint and intermittent, the way it was when the wind was moving in the canopy above. Movement. In the gap between a western red cedar and a Douglas fir, about 40 yards from where I was sitting. Not sudden movement. A shift of weight, a slight forward lean. The shadow I had cataloged as part of the cedar was not the cedar. It was standing in front of the cedar. It had been standing there for a period I couldn't estimate. Now it was done being still. I put my coffee mug on the ground beside the chair. I kept my hands on my knees. I breathed. The gap between the cedar and the fir was approximately 6 feet at the base, narrowing above to the point where the canopies overlapped. The figure standing in the gap filled it. The shoulders were at the width of the gap at about 7 feet up. I would measure that gap the following morning with my tape measure. 6 feet 2 inches. The figure's shoulders spanned it at 7 feet. The crown of the head cleared the first major cedar branch on the left side. I would also measure that branch off the ground the next morning. 8 feet 3 inches. The top of the head cleared it by the width of my hand. The hair was very dark. In the fading light, I could not separate the precise color, but the base was a deep brown, so dark it read as near black in shadow, and through it, at the brow ridge, along the sides of the face and down the forearms where the hair thinned, there was silver. Old silver, the kind that has been there for years, distributed in the way of age rather than the way of stress. The hair across the back and shoulders was long and dense. Across the chest it was thinner, and below it I could see the skin. Dark, the gray-brown of old bark in wet weather. The arms were long, the forearms heavier than the upper arms in a proportion that reversed what I was used to seeing. The hands hanging open at the sides with fingers long enough and thick enough to read at 40 yards in failing light. The face was broad, wide across the cheekbones, the nose flat and wide with large nostrils, the jaw heavy and squared. The brow ridge was a shelf, pronounced, and beneath it the eyes were set deep and looking at me. Not searching, not scanning, at me. The way the eyes are at something rather than looking for it. It had known where I was. It had probably known where I was long before I moved the chair to this position, long before I sat down that evening, possibly before I had woken up that morning. The eyes were amber. A warm amber, not gold, not the flat, reflective bounce of prey eyes in low light. Something that received light and returned it differently. The way a lamp holds light compared to how a mirror holds light. I had been carrying the memory of the infrared still frame since July 15th, and it had not prepared me for the amber in open air at 40 yards in the last of the evening light. The hum started. I had heard it on 11 camera clips compressed through the recording. In open air, it was something else. It began below normal hearing, a vibration in the chest and along the jaw before the ears found it as sound, and then resolved into a tone that was sustained and low and rhythmic, the rhythm slow enough that I found myself timing my breath to it before I noticed I was doing it. Not threatening, not interrogative. The sound of something at rest. A comfort sound. I have thought about that distinction many times since August of 2009, and the comfort distinction is the one that holds. We held the distance for approximately 4 minutes. At the end of that time, the figure in the gap turned, slowly without urgency, the way a person turns when they've decided to leave but aren't running from anything, and took one step back into the cedar. And the cedar closed around it the way the Pacific Northwest closes around everything it takes, completely, without remainder. The ferns moved in the evening air. The creek ran below. A varied thrush called once from somewhere high in the fir canopy. I sat in the camp chair until it was too dark to see the tree line clearly. Then I went inside and lit the propane lantern and wrote for 2 hours. The exchange continued through August and into September in ways that shifted what I thought I understood about what was happening. The fish kept coming, the chanterelles kept coming, but the quality of what appeared on the step was changing. The bandana I left on August 4th was gone in the morning and reappeared on the porch railing 6 days later, folded to the same dimensions I'd left it, the fold creases different from mine. Not a rejection, a return. Something had taken it, kept it for a period, and brought it back. The apple I left disappeared overnight and was replaced with 3 pieces of wild ginger root, Azarum caudatum, washed clean and bound together with a twist of green grass stem. I looked up the ginger in the wild plant identification book in the back room. Grows in the dark understory of the Pacific Northwest forests under fir and hemlock. Used medicinally by regional tribes for stomach complaints. The root I'd been left was fresh, the soil removed, the skin intact, prepared. On September 3rd, after a night that had dropped into the high 30s, I found a stick on the step. 8 inches long, peeled of bark, the white wood smooth and cool. Thumb diameter. Along one face of the stick, at even intervals, notches, regular, cut into the wood with a sharp edge. The basalt tool, I thought, or something like it. Not the random chew damage of an animal working bark. Notches. I counted them. 12. I sat on the step with the stick in my hands and counted again. 12. And then I counted something else. The weeks from July 8th, the date of my first personal notebook entry about the smell. The first day I'd acknowledged in writing that something was present to September 3rd. 12 weeks. Someone was keeping count. Someone was marking the weeks of the exchange from the day of the first acknowledgement and had left the record on the step for me to find. I took the stick inside and set it on the desk next to the basalt tool. I sat in the chair and looked at both of them. Both made. Both requiring planning, intention, and a concept of time. My professional vocabulary handles trail conditions, visitor compliance, resource management, and fire preparedness. None of it addressed what I was looking at. Dave Larson drove up on September 5th, a Thursday. He was in his early 30s, 12 years younger than me, competent and straightforward, a by-the-book ranger in the ways I'd once been and now navigated carefully in other people. He had been with the Randall district for 5 years, and he was good at his work, and I liked him. And his presence in the clearing that morning made me aware of the distance between what I knew about the cabin and what he could be told about it. I heard his truck on the spur road about 10 minutes before he appeared in the clearing, and in those 10 minutes I moved the SD card from the laptop bag to my shirt pocket. I do not have a fully satisfying explanation for why I moved it. The impulse was clear, and I followed it. He brought propane canisters, coffee, canned goods, and the district paperwork that accumulates over a summer. Field reports to review, a wildfire preparedness update, the fall trail maintenance schedule. We unloaded the truck and went inside, and I made coffee, and we sat at the table the way 2 people sit when one of them has been alone for 10 weeks and the other is the first human company in 6. Dave talked easily about the district office, about a permit dispute on the Lewis River corridor, about his daughter starting kindergarten in September. I listened and talked back about ordinary things and kept the ordinary things in the front of my mind where they belonged. Then he mentioned the track report. A hiker from Portland, a woman who had been in the Gifford Pin Show every summer for a decade and knew bear from regular bear country experience, had called the Skamania County Sheriff's Office in Stevenson. Large tracks near the Dark Divide Trailhead access, she'd said. Bigger than any bear track I've seen, and I know what bear tracks look like. The sheriff's office had forwarded it to the Randall district as a standard wildlife sighting report. Anything unusual up here? Dave asked. I thought about the 12-notch stick on the desk in the back room. I thought about the amber eyes in the July 15th clip. I thought about R. Hagen and T. Bauer and D. Sato's 5 words and my own 2003 entry. Nothing I couldn't account for, I said. Dave noticed the chanterelles drying on the rack next to the propane range. Nice. Where'd you find those? Up the drainage, I said. True as far as it went. He left at 2 in the afternoon. I walked him to his truck and watched the truck back down the spur to the forest road, and the sound of the engine faded into the timber. And the clearing was quiet again, and the musk was already in from the south tree line. I went inside. I took the SD card out of my shirt pocket. 61 clips from July 14th through September 4th, the amber eyes, the gift placements, the hum audible on 11 of the clips. Dave had mentioned a hiker's track report at the Dark Divide trailhead, which the sheriff's office had filed as a standard wildlife sighting and which would go into a district record and stay there. I sat at the table and thought about what standard procedure would look like if I walked into the Randall district office with the card. A biologist first, then a team, then equipment and camera traps, hair snares, scent lures, possibly aerial thermal if the evidence compelled it. And because nothing about this stays contained once it moves through an institution, a report. And a report at that level, with that quality of documentation, would bring people into this drainage that the drainage had not had in it before. Not a weekend hiker, not a recreation visitor, people with protocols and equipment and an institutional mandate to document what I had been protecting by not documenting. The thing in the timber above Quartz Creek had been in contact with this cabin since at least 1961. It had been in contact through a succession of rangers who each, in their own way, had made the same choice about what to do with what they found. R. Hagen had walked the tracks into the timber and not written it in the official patrol report. Bauer had noted the woodpile and the smell and not written it in the official patrol report. D. Sato's 5 words were as deliberate a non-report as any I had ever seen. And my own 2003 entry had vanished into the personal notebook the same way. Whatever the thing in the trees was, it had managed its own survival through an arrangement that had worked for 63 years and counting, sufficient proximity to the cabin to maintain the exchange. Sufficient caution to remain outside the bounds of what rangers felt compelled to officially report. That arrangement had been maintained as much by the rangers as by the thing itself. I was the latest ranger in a line of them that went back to a man named Walt Hagen in 1958, and my contribution to the arrangement was not going to be the one that ended it. I copied all 61 clips to an encrypted folder on the laptop. I copied the folder to a thumb drive that went into the glove box of my truck beneath the registration papers. I kept the amber eyes still frame extracted from the July 15th clip, the single best frame from the clearest partial facial shot, on a separate SD card that went into my wallet. Then I formatted the camera's card and put it back in the Moultrie. The last weeks of the posting had the quality that endings always have when you know they're ending. I stayed in the camp chair longer in the evenings as the September cold came in, the temperature dropping into the mid-30s by 9 at night. The frost heavy on the ferns in the mornings, the clearing grass going yellow-brown. The huckleberry season ended. The chanterelles slowed. The creek dropped, the snowmelt long gone, running clear and low over its rocks. The exchanges continued, quieter now. The gaps between them longer. In late September, I found a single raven feather on the step. A primary wing feather. Perfectly intact. The iridescent black of it going blue-green in the morning light at the right angle. Nothing else on the step. Just the feather. I have thought about that feather many times in the 15 years since, about what it means to bring a single feather to a step and leave it with nothing else and go. I don't have a satisfying account. I kept the feather. It is in the same drawer as the pale wood. One morning in early October, a small branch appeared on the step, stripped of bark, the white wood smooth about the length of my forearm. No markings on it. I set it on the railing. The following morning, it was gone and had been replaced with a pile of Douglas fir seeds emptied from their cones, the cone scales arranged carefully around them in a circle on the step. Seeds. I thought about what you bring someone seeds for, and I thought about the winter that was coming and the spring on the other side of it. On October 12th, the night before, I planned to close the cabin and drive down to Randall. I set 3 things on the step at 8 in the evening. A handful of venison jerky from my personal trail stock, a wool camp blanket, red, folded flat and dry, and a folded piece of paper in a Ziploc bag. The paper couldn't be read. I wrote on it anyway because the intention of writing it was true even if the words didn't translate. I'll be back in June. I'll bring fish. In the morning, the jerky was gone, the blanket was gone, the Ziploc bag with the note was gone. On the step where they had been, a piece of pale heartwood, split open to expose the interior face, dried flat, about the size of my hand. The pale interior face had been scored with marks. Regular, even, deliberate. I counted them. 15. I sat on the step in the October cold, my breath making small clouds in the still air, the frost still heavy on the clearing grass, and I counted them again. 15 marks, scored at even intervals in a line across the interior of the pale wood. I worked out the count. July 8th, first notebook entry, first acknowledgement, 15 weeks to October 12th. Someone had counted the weeks from the beginning of what I thought of as the exchange to the last morning of the posting, and had left the record where I would find it, the way you leave a note for someone who is going away. Not for their information. They knew the count. For mine. I wrapped the pale wood in the red bandana that had been returned to the porch railing in August, clean and folded without explanation. I put both in my pack. I winterized the cabin, emptied the water lines, secured the propane connections, latched the storm shutters, padlocked the door. I drove down the spur to Forest Road 90 and east along the Lewis River to Randall. I filed the end-of-season patrol summary. Nothing in it was untrue. Nothing in it was complete. I've been back every summer since, with one exception. In 2015, a surgery in April ran my recovery into the posting season, and I couldn't get to the cabin until September, by which point the assignment structure had changed, and I was covering from a district vehicle rather than living in the cabin for the full posting. I don't know what the summer of 2015 was like at Quartz Creek without me. I have thought about it. I try not to think about it too long. The exchanges have not stopped. Some summers are more frequent than others. Some gifts are things I recognize immediately, and some are things I have to sit with for a week before I understand what I'm looking at. In 2013, I found a piece of old-growth fir bark laid across the top step, the inner surface marked with a pattern. Not the notch tally system from 2009. Something different. Groups of parallel marks and clusters that I have not fully worked out. I have photographs of it on the laptop. I have not shown them to anyone except my daughter. I showed Amy the laptop footage on a Saturday in February of 2010. I drove to Olympia, where she was working for the Washington Department of Natural Resources. She's a botanist, has been since she finished at Western Washington in 2006, and I set the laptop on her kitchen table and played the July 15th clip. She watched it through without speaking. Then I played it again. Then I pulled up the amber eyes still frame and zoomed it to where I zoom it when I need to confirm it's real. She looked at it for a long time. "What are you going to do?" she said. "Nothing that changes anything," I told her. "I'm keeping the posting. I'm keeping the record, not filing a report. What if something happens to you? Then you have the thumb drive. You'll know what to do with it." She thought about that. Amy thinks before she speaks, always has, and I have always valued it. After a while, she said, okay. I drove back to Packwood with that okay, and I've been carrying it in the same pocket as the SD card with the amber eyes frame. Amy calls sometimes from the field when she's doing vegetation surveys in the Olympics or the Cascades. She'll say the forest was quiet today in a particular way, or she'll say she found something on a game trail she can't identify, and I'll know what she means by the specific way she says it, and she'll know I know. We don't talk about it directly very often. It doesn't require a lot of direct talk. I have thought a great deal over 15 years about Skamania County Ordinance 69-01, April 1st of 1969, April Fool's Day, which caused a certain amount of confusion about whether the county commission was being serious or performing a publicity stunt. The ordinance was serious. It went onto the books as binding county law, a $10,000 fine and up to 5 years in county jail for hunting, killing, or trapping a Bigfoot or Sasquatch within Skamania County's jurisdiction. It was amended in 1984 and again in 1991. It is still law in Skamania County today, which is the county where the Quartz Creek cabin sits. I was a kid in April of '69 and I didn't know anything about county ordinances. I thought about the Skamania ordinance for the first time seriously in the late summer of 2009, sitting on the porch with the basalt tool on the desk in the back room and the logbook entries stacked in my memory and the SD card in my shirt pocket. The thing that struck me was not that the ordinance existed. I had known about it for years as a piece of regional history, something the county occasionally had to explain to people who assumed it was a joke. What struck me was the category of response it represented. People who sit on county commissions in rural southwestern Washington do not pass protection ordinances for subjects they do not believe require protecting. The Skamania County Commission in 1969 looked at whatever they knew or whatever people they trusted had told them they knew, and they decided that the appropriate governmental response was not documentation, not study, not investigation. It was protection. That is a specific choice with a specific meaning, and the fact that they updated the ordinance in '84 and again in '91 suggests it was a choice they had occasion to recommit to. I have never contacted the county about what I found. I have never reached out to the Bigfoot research organizations, and there are several, some of which are more rigorous in their methodology than their public reputation would suggest. I have read some of the reports filed by people who work in this kind of country and know it the way I know mine, and their accounts are consistent in the details that matter. The smell, the tracks, the structures, the sound. I am not the only person who has found the pieces. I am, I think, one of the fewer who found them in sufficient quantity and sufficient circumstance that the pattern became impossible to deny, and denial began to feel like a choice rather than a conclusion. I made a different choice. The piece of pale wood with the 15 marks is in the center drawer of my desk in Packwood, wrapped in the red bandana the way I wrapped it on October 13th of 2009. I take it out sometimes in the evenings when the rain is on the roof and the house is quiet, and I count the marks. They are still sharp. The scoring was done with care, and the care shows in the evenness of the spacing and the consistent depth of each mark. 15 of them in a line across the pale interior of the heartwood, telling the same thing they told the morning I sat on the step in the October cold and counted them. Something kept count. Something watched the summer pass from July to October and marked the weeks and left the record where I would find it on the last morning. The way you leave something for someone who is going away so they know you were paying attention to how long they were there. I go up to the cabin each June. The drive up Forest Road 90 takes 45 minutes from Randall through the corridor of second growth Douglas fir, and then into the older timber where the road narrows and the canopy closes overhead. and the temperature drops 4 or 5 degrees, and the air smells of moss and cold water and the particular green of a forest that has been doing what it does for a very long time. I know when I have crossed into the older timber without looking at the odometer, because the sound of the truck changes the density of the standing wood, altering the engine noise in a way I cannot fully describe. It is simply what I notice. The cabin needs the same early season work every year. The wood stove firebox, the radio battery, the well pump, the access road clearing. The first evening, I always walk the perimeter of the clearing before I do anything else, not checking anything specific. Getting reacquainted with the proportions of the place. The angle of the late light across the ferns when they are still a young pale green before the summer deepens them. The camp chair goes to the same position it has occupied since 2009. The camera goes on the northeast corner post the second week, and I spend an hour leveling it and checking the angle and making sure the porch step is centered in the frame. On the first clear evening of each season, I sit in the camp chair at the edge of the clearing and I say whatever comes to mind. The drive up, the winter, what Amy has been working on, what I saw on the patrol that afternoon. Normal things, true things. The forest goes quiet in its particular way when the musk comes in, and I have learned to sit in that quiet the way you sit in the company of someone who doesn't need you to fill the silence. The amber eyes come when they come. Not every summer, not on a schedule, but they come, and on the mornings after they come, the step holds what the step holds, and I pick it up and hold it in my hands and add it to the record, and the record grows. 15 years since July 15th of 2009, the Quartz Creek drainage is still there. The dark divide is still there. The cabin is still there. Its cedar shakes going a deeper silver every season. The wood stove needing a new baffle, but otherwise sound. The Moultrie on the northeast corner post. The composition notebooks on the shelf above the desk, 5 volumes of them now. The personal record of what the camera log and the patrol summary cannot hold. Every ranger who spent a season at Quartz Creek and found what there is to find in that clearing made their own choice about what to do with it. R. Hagen walked the tracks into the timber and wrote nothing in the official patrol report. Bauer wrote about the woodpile and the smell in the personal log and nothing more. D. Sato wrote 5 words. I wrote 6 decades of accumulated silence and then 61 clips on an encrypted drive and a thumb drive in the glove box of a truck in Packwood, and an okay from my daughter, who is a botanist and who knows what the forest sounds like when it goes quiet in a particular way. All of us held the same line. I don't think we were wrong to hold it. I think the thing we were protecting was worth protecting. I think it has been here longer than the cabin and longer than the district and longer than the National Forest designation and longer than the county itself. And I think that its being here is worth more than any documentation of it could produce. The morning of the fish. The amber eyes in the dark returning the infrared light as something other than reflection. The marks on the pale wood, 15 of them, careful and even, the record